in life, it is important to look back so you can understand why and how you got into the situation you're currently in. And then after looking back, you look at the situation currently. And then you assess how you can move forward. And that is my goal of this video series. This will be the last video where I talk about the past. In the next video, I will explain the present. But we cannot understand the present of why we're in this situation if we don't understand how we got to the situation. Obama's slogan was "Change we can believe in." Why then did Obama hire many of the same people who worked in the Clinton administration? During the election, why did Obama consult Robert Rubin, who just recently resigned as head of Citigroup, a company on the verge of its own collapse, and that has received some $45 billion in bailout funds from the taxpayer for advice on the economy? Why did he appoint Larry Summers to be the director of the White House Economic Council, and Timothy Geithner, former head of the Federal Reserve of New York, to be his secretary of the Treasury? All of these men were members of the Clinton economic team and played a part in the repeal of Glass-Steagall of 1933. The Glass-Steagall Act is actually a set of provisions included in the broader Banking Act of 1933, a move to restore confidence in the banking system after thousands of bank failures in the first years of the Depression. Remember, the Fed, as I talked about in my previous video, the Fed expanded the money supply, giving banks and people loans. They created a new type of investment where you could pay 10% and a stockbroker would pay the other 90%. But the catch was, anytime they called that in, you had to repay it in full, or you had to sell the stock. And so they ended up having massive call-ins, and then they lowered the money supply, so there's no money in circulation to pay back those loans. The banks went bankrupt, and individuals who were in the elite families bought up those banks on pennies on the dollar. They ended up taking over those banks and consolidating the power to create money, set interest rates, and control the financial system. And so the Glass-Steagall Act, what it did was, in simple terms, it separated savings banks, which had access to Federal Reserve funds, from investment banks. Clinton, Rubin, Summers, and Geithner succeeded in repealing Glass-Steagall in order to legitimize the formation of Citigroup. At the time, Citigroup was in violation of the Glass-Steagall Act. When it's all over, the Secretary of Treasury, Robert Rubin, became the vice chairman of the emerging Citigroup. Robert Rubin was Obama's advisor during the presidential campaign. One of Obama's secretaries of the Treasury was Timothy Geithner, who was Undersecretary of the Treasury from 1998 to 2001, under Secretaries Rubin and Lawrence Summers. Summers is Geithner's mentor. In other words, these same men who are partially responsible for triggering the 2008 financial crash were Obama's advisors. And the way they did that, partially, it was a big thing. I can get into that in another video if you guys would like. But it involved Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. It involved government. It involved banks. It involved legislation. It was a complicated conflict. See, I'm not like individuals that look for a boogeyman to blame financial crisis, wars, elections, depressions, recessions on. I look at all parties involved, their motives, their actions, and then I give them partial blame. It's not my job to bring up a whipping boy and make them responsible. So I'm not even saying Obama was responsible for this at all. But their role in this was they allowed the combining of savings banks with investment banks so they could use, in other words, if you put money in the bank for savings. They could invest that money into other venues, like housing. And when they lost that money, the banks became insolvent, and the individuals whose money was in those banks lost all that money. You used to not be able to do that. You used to have to not do that if it was an investment bank. You couldn't combine the two. And basically, my question was, how was change supposed to happen if the same people who expanded the financial mess were still in charge? Is that what Obama meant when he said change we could believe in? Could it be they wanted to protect the system rather than fix it? Obama hired virtually the same financial team from the Clinton administration because he wanted to protect the same system that is designed to make the rich richer. In 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve granted the very rich of the world the power to control the money supply of the United States. The Federal Reserve is not a government institution or a bank, and it doesn't have any reserves. Rather, it's a banking cartel run by some of the most powerful men in the financial world. The creation of the Fed was basically a license to print money. Another reason it was created was to protect the biggest banks from failing by providing liquidity to those banks when they were in financial trouble, which protects the wealth of the rich, not of the taxpayer. We see this happen all the time. In 2008, President Bush authorized $700 billion in bailout money. Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Paulson, formerly of Goldman Sachs. There you see that public-private partnership. People work in big banks, big oil, big financial institutions. They work for the government, and then they go back to those institutions. With the help of the Fed, immediately handed out billions of dollars to the biggest banks, his friends in the country. TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. The reality of the situation is that the TARP bailout money went straight from the taxpayer's pocket into the pockets of the banks and corporations that helped create our financial mess in the first place. We were told the money was given to the banks with a mandate to lend it out, but that didn't happen. In mid-December 2008, when USA Today asked banks what they were doing with the bailout money, J.P. Morgan Chase, a bank that received $25 billion in taxpayer money, declined to comment. The bank bailout was just a rich friend handout. It had nothing to do with saving the economy. 10 of the 13 big beneficiaries of the Treasury Department's TARP program saw their loan balances decline by a total of about $46 billion, or 1.4%, between the third and fourth quarters of 2008. After receiving all that money from the taxpayer that they lost, they did not loan out that money to us, even though we bailed their asses out, the taxpayers. This despite receiving $148 billion in taxpayer TARP funds, intended to stimulate lending. But the TARP money, $700 billion, was small compared to the entire scope. The entire program was $7.7 trillion. I think I read this on PBS at the time. Once in a while, the mainstream media will do some good journalism, and this is one of the examples. The Fed declined to release the funding, and the banks declined to disclose. What were they doing with the funds? And so I got into, that's pretty recent history. I know it doesn't seem like it, but it was over 10 years ago. That's pretty recent history, especially in the span of the world. But that just shows you how we bailed the banks out after they used our money, with our money, and they refused to disclose what they were doing with that money they received. They weren't loaning it out to us because their loans declined by 1.4%. 7.7 trillion, don't forget that. And the guy that was instrumental in that was Henry Paulson, who worked for Goldman Sachs, one of the banks responsible for the financial crisis. And Obama used the same people who Clinton used to repeal what made this possible in the first place, to advise him on his economic team. In 1974, the U.S. Congress passed the ERISA. This forced Americans to invest in the stock market for their retirement through vehicles like the 401k, which genuinely has higher fees, high risk, and low returns. It, more importantly, gave Wall Street control over the country's retirement money. In 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created, the 16th Amendment was passed, making an income tax permanent. Now the rich have their hands in taxpayers' pockets permanently. In 1971, President Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. The U.S. was printing more money than gold reserves, so when France asked to exchange the dollar for gold, Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard altogether. Once Nixon got rid of the link between the dollar and gold prices started to rise. Prior to 1971, our money was golden because it was backed by gold. Today, it is nothing more than monopoly money. Money became debt. For the economy to expand, you and I had to go into debt. That's why credit cards came in the mail and home equity loans became available to people with terrible credit. Technically, the money in your wallet isn't money, it's an IOU. Our money is debt. From 2000 to present, the U.S. biggest export is debt. Since 1971, the dollar has lost over, here it says 87%, but now it's over 95% of its purchasing power. In 1944, just as World War II was about to end, a meeting of international banking leaders was held at a resort in Britain, New Hampshire. This conference resulted in the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. This has resulted in the spread of a fiat monetary system throughout the world. In 1971, when the dollar was severed from gold, the IMF and World Bank required the rest of the world to separate from the gold standard or be separated from their club. In 1933, FDR asked the American public to turn in their gold, for which they were paid $22 per ounce, $20.22 per ounce. In other words, for every $20.22 that was turned in, the public was cheated out of $15, a 58% heist. If anyone was caught holding, the punishment was $10,000 fine and 10 years in jail. One reason for doing this was to get the public used to paper money as solid currency of the world. Another reason was to cover up the fact that the U.S. government had printed too many paper dollars and did not have enough gold reserves back then. In other words, the U.S. government was broke. In 1975, President Gerald Ford allowed the American public to own physical gold. Once again, only after the bank was no longer linked to gold. Who cared about the gold when those who controlled our government and our banks could now print money at will? And so that's just a little bit of footnotes. I could go more in depth, but if I were to touch everything as intricate as I wanted to, this video would be 5 hours long. But that is a few footnotes on the history of the U.S. monetary system. All these things have something in common. They gave the public a bullshit reason. They consolidated power and control over printing the money, what backs the money up. And now they control the exchange of goods and services all across the world. And another note to make, in 1971, in Nixon's quote-unquote gold shock, he tied the U.S. dollar to oil, which is the petrodollar, to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia bought off U.S. treasuries. They would sell gold in U.S. treasuries. And that linked the United States with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia owns a huge chunk of our debt. And that's where the term petrodollar came into play, because our dollar, instead of being backed up by gold, was now backed up by oil. But now that the United States is becoming independent, energy independent, through policies, through offshore drilling, through fracking and other reasons, discovery of oil fields